Remember the long life of the Reverend Billy Graham, a man who preached the gospel of Jesus Christ and led millions to Christ. Finally today, the world said its final goodbye to the evangelist, and we're taking a look back at the life and legacy of this humble servant who went home to be with the Lord at age 99.
On your side, WBTV News on Bounce starts right now.
Good evening and welcome on this Friday. We want to thank you for joining us tonight for a special edition of WBTV News on Bounce, a community conversation honoring the life and legacy of the Reverend Billy Graham. I want to welcome all of our guests tonight. I am thrilled to have here at the table WBTV's David Wisnett and Steve Crump. They have been covering all of this extensively, not just today for Reverend Graham's homegoing, but really since the news first broke of his passing. So thank you. It's been a long day for you guys. Appreciate you being here, and we will value your perspective. And over in the wings, we have a number of guests with us tonight. Dr. Ann Wills from Davidson College, Dr. Grant Wacker of Duke Divinity School, Ken Garfield from Myers Park United Methodist Church here in Charlotte, and Dr. Ricky Woods from First Baptist Church West, also here in Charlotte. We will be speaking with each of our guests periodically, I should say, throughout the night on various topics, but I want to dive right in with the two of you and first talk about the funeral for Reverend Graham today, because I watched at home before I came into work and I could feel the energy and how powerful it was. So I can only imagine what it must have been like for you guys to be there witnessing, really, I think, just a major moment, certainly in Charlotte's, history, but for the world too.
I think, and it's something that I said earlier this week, and that is, in many respects for Charlotte, this was the closest thing we will ever see to a state funeral. And when you look at the fact that you have the president there, the vice president, Cardinal Dolan from New York, he was there. There were folks that represent the Orthodox faith that were there. It showed, the reach and the appeal of Billy Graham. And for this day, Charlotte was pretty much on the world stage.
What struck me was that it seemed to me like one of the Billy Graham crusades, because so many of the elements of his funeral service are the elements that you found in a crusade. I went to a crusade in 1996 when it was, at the time, Ericsson Stadium. And you go to those crusades or you watch them on television, and there would be the special music, of course, and then there would be the message, and sometimes there'd be special guests, even local celebrities from time to time. And you saw some of those elements today. There was congregational singing. Then you had famous singers like Michael W. Smith. Stephen Curtis Chapman didn't perform, but he was there. And then the Gaither Vocal Band, so you had some of those elements. And then instead of a message at the funeral that was all about the deceased, it was more about God. Because you're talking about a man who is inseparable from his message. And so that's what you really got. You got more about the same message that Reverend Graham has preached for decades. That was a big part of the funeral.
And the only thing that seemed to be missing from the service was the signature altar call. I mean, because you had everything there as far as the folks sitting in the chairs that were engaged in some of the hymns there, in the prayers, the reaction to Scripture, and other than, I guess, where people turn their life over to Christ at the end of a Billy Graham service or crusade. You didn't have that, but then
you've had part of it though, because towards the
Franklin
end,
Graham.
Franklin Graham called on the individuals there to make a decision.
But you didn't have the people walking up. That's
right.
Which is always the theater, if you will.
He's speaking before the president, the vice president, and all these other folks, and still says you have to make this decision, and still points out that this is a personal decision you have to make. So.
And I think that what we've heard over the past several days is that Reverend Graham would not have liked this fuss and said he didn't want things to be about Billy. It was about the Lord. And I think for so much of today's homegoing, if you will, it was that, and of course they talked about Reverend Graham and who he was as a father, as a husband, and not just this iconic evangelist who traveled the world, speaking to some 215 million people
That's
over
just in person.
Right, over the
right.
course of his work. And he said he was doing the work of the Lord.
Well, you know, David, I remember you and I, what was it, 10, 11 years or so ago, we were there for the opening of that library when they had the 4 former presidents that were there, and, you know, you had that crowd, similar environment in that regard. And the things that stuck with me, he said, too much Billy Graham, and he also said, I feel like I'm attending my own funeral. You know,
He did say that.
In that regard.
Yeah, he did. And another thing that made those two events similar is using the hymn, To God Be the Glory. That was the hymn that was used at the close of that service. That was the hymn that was performed today, To God Be the Glory. So once again, take the focus off of Billy Graham and put it somewhere else. Put it to God.
Well, and the fact of the matter is, this event had been planned for a long, long time. It's not like one day they got up and said, "Oh, we got to have a funeral." No, there was a lot of planning. Everything from the logistics of transportation and you know, who would be there and the guest list, and it pretty much had a textbook ending in many respects.
Yeah, happiest funeral I've ever seen.
Yeah,
I remember you saying that today during our coverage. There was a moment, though, and this was a service full of moments, but really a powerful moment from Ruth Graham, one of Billy Graham's daughters, talking about the kind of man her father was, that gave, I thought, incredible insight to Billy Graham, the man, the husband, the father. She told a story about how her divorce and then marrying someone else not too soon afterward, and how her father reacted when she came to see him once she realized that that second marriage was a mistake. Really powerful. We're going to talk about it on the other side of this, so take a listen.
And many of you know that we live on the side of a mountain. And as I wound myself up the mountain, I rounded the last bend in my father's driveway, and my father was standing there waiting for me. As I got out of the car, he wrapped his arms around me and he said, "Welcome home." There was no shame, there was no blame, there was no condemnation, just unconditional love. And you know, my father was not God, but he showed me what God was like that day.
Wow.
It takes you right back. I imagine you guys heard that in person, and that stopped me in my tracks when I was at home. For her to open up such an incredibly personal moment in her life, one that did not end well, and to provide a little more context, she said that her family, you know, had said to her, had warned her essentially not to go through with this marriage. Her kids didn't like this man, and she said, "Oh, you know, they're almost grown. I can do what I want. They can't tell me what to do." And so she went ahead and did this, realized she had made this colossal mistake, and kind of had to come home and didn't know what to expect. And then to get that, what was the mood like when she was speaking?
Well, it was riveting for one, but I think it also demonstrated, even though you come from a family such as the Graham family that people think is very perfect in nature, that you know, they have their frailties just like everyone else. And I think that that kind of humanized the experience to say, okay, the people, many of the folks that were in the crowd can relate to a story like that. And maybe in that regard, perhaps it said, she's one of us.
Well, and then with Franklin as well, he hasn't hidden some of his demons. In his book, Rebel with a Cause, he talks about his past and having to come to terms with his faith, with his Christianity, and with his father. So, you know, at least you've got a couple of examples there of those family members who put out there that, yeah, we do have the same struggles that everyone else has. The same issues come up.
And just because our father is Billy Graham does not mean that we are exempt from the challenges of life, from making those, you know, mistakes. But that he still greeted her with love the way God greets us, even when we have sinned. He is always willing to forgive.
And I think the key word there was unconditional.
Yeah.
Well, we are just getting started here on WBTV News here on Bounce, an important and very special community conversation looking back and honoring the life and legacy of the Reverend Billy Graham. We have a full hour for you here tonight. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back to this special community conversation on the life and legacy of the Reverend Billy Graham, a special edition of WBTV News on Bounce tonight. The next topic that we want to dwell on for a few moments, if you will, is Billy Graham's marriage and family life. And we have Dr. Ann Wills. She is a professor at Davidson College, also the co-editor of the book, Billy Graham, An American Pilgrim. She is also in the process of writing a biography on Billy Graham's late wife, Ruth. So glad that you could be here with us tonight. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
We also have Dr. Grant Wacker. He's a professor at Duke Divinity School who also has written a book on Billy Graham, America's Pastor, Billy Graham and the Shaping of a Nation. Thank you as well. So let's first talk about family and marriage, because I think, and rightfully so, people focus on who he was as this renowned evangelist, but we also hear a lot of stories about his faithfulness to his wife and his family. And both of you, having written books on Graham, obviously can speak extensively to that. First to you, and just talking about Ruth and the type of woman she was.
She was very smart. She was a very faithful Christian. Her children talk about her leaving Bibles at various places around their home, and so when she was in the middle of doing some housework or doing a chore or helping them with their homework, she would also be reading the Bible. She also had a serious study of the scripture on her own. She had a desk that she would work at, and did a lot of writing, did a lot of poetry. Today, during the funeral service, their daughter Gigi, read a poem that Ruth wrote as a little girl, kind of imagining what her future husband might be like. She was a lot of fun. She had a kind of a wicked sense of humor. She liked to play tricks on people. And so, just a combination of very faithful, committed, very much in love with Billy Graham. Bill, she called him Bill. She didn't call him Billy. She thought that was silly to call a grown man Billy. But just a very committed mother and wife, and creative leader of that family.
And I imagine she would have to be strong, smart, all of that stuff, because Dr. Graham traveled obviously extensively, particularly during the height of, his career, the Crusades. Dr. Wacker, can you speak to that part of it? Because obviously their marriage was not just this incredible love story, it was also a great partnership.
It was. He was away from home about 8 months a year. And it requires a lot of commitment on the part of Ruth, as well as the children, for have an absent father that much. And that's part of the evangelical tradition that we don't see so much anymore. But for a long time, the tradition was that people with a strong sense of mission will make the mission the priority of life over family. That has changed, but in his day, that's the way it stood. And I'd say a word about the children is that there's been some attention lately, especially with Mr. Graham's death, some attention to the ups and downs of the family life, children's ups and downs. I think what's remarkable is that they are all Christian to this day. I can imagine that in ordinary families that are under that much scrutiny, I mean, you can't go to the grocery store if you're a grandchild without being, examined by the press. And I think it's remarkable that they are as close to the faith as they are. Not that there was any very normal variations.
And also, I want to touch on, I feel like it was by design that they decided to have that home in Montreat, this stable life away from the spotlight, if you will, living on the side of a mountain. If you two can speak to that and how I imagine Ruth had an instrumental part in making that decision.
Yeah, she very much was the person who made that decision. Her parents, Dr. and Mrs. Bell, were living there. They had retired as missionaries from China, And as a lot of Presbyterian missionaries did in that day, they furloughed in Montreat, and then when they retired from the field, they left the field, they retired to Montreat. Ruth, not long after that, came to live with them while Billy was traveling with Youth for Christ, and all of the children were born in Montreat. She lived with her parents for a couple of years maybe, and then moved across the street. They were on the main drag in Montreat, which is Assembly Drive. As the family grew, so did the attention to Billy, and people started invading their space. So Ruth would talk about the buses driving by and the people coming into the yard and the children being interested in attracting people into the yard and people coming and looking in the windows. And she said, okay, it's time to move up the mountain. So, and that's the house that Billy Graham passed away in, was the house that she built and that they grew old together in, that the children were raised in and that they grew old together in. But that was definitely her decision to put them there, put them in Montreat.
Well, her wit was legendary, and there are all these stories of the things that Ruth said, and you can almost write them down. But one of them I like is that she said, going back to Ann's comment about all the people stopping and getting into the yard, and she said if the people stopped and came up in the yard, we knew they were Baptists. If they just slowed down, they were Presbyterians. And if they just kept on going, they were Episcopalians.
Speaking to, this decision to have this home away from the spotlight, I feel like we have to touch on Ruth's desire for Billy Graham to stay out of politics. We are going to play some sound for you, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
And one little story that has never been told, I don't think publicly, he asked me the weekend before the Democratic Convention in 1964, he had Ruth and me as his only guests. And at the table, he asked me who he ought to choose as vice president. He'd already read off a list of 14. And I started to answer, and Ruth kicked me under the table, and I said, Ruth, why did you kick me? And the president looked at her and said, Ruth, did you kick Billy? And said, yes. She said, he ought to stick to only moral and religious advice to you, Mr. President. And he said, Ruth, I agree with you. So Mrs. Johnson and Ruth got up and went out, and when the door was closed, the president turned to me and he said in a very soft voice, he said, now who do you think I really ought to choose? I said, well, Mr. President, I said, I'm really for Hubert Humphrey. Not that had any influence on Johnson. I don't think it did, because he was more pragmatic than that, but I did say Hubert Humphrey.
After your wife left the room? After
my wife left the room.
But you don't want to give this advice anymore?
No, I think I've had enough of politics. I think that I'm going to stay out of that arena and just preach the gospel of Christ.
After hearing what you guys just said, I mean, that totally, not surprised to hear that story. Your reaction to that?
He was an evangelist. That's who she had married, and that's where she knew that God had called him and called her to support him in that. And yeah, that's a classic story of stick to your knitting, be an evangelist.
Stay in your lane.
Stay in your lane, yes, absolutely, yeah.
Now, in fact, he did not do that, as he acknowledged here.
Right.
And that's one of the great problems of his career, is that he did get entangled in politics up through the time, well, through Richard Nixon, and then after Nixon's debacle, then Graham committed that he would stay out of politics, and he did for the most part. He fell off the wagon a few times, but he tried to stay out of politics, and I'm sure that's what Ruth wanted him to do, is to keep the message free of entanglement with these kind of secular affairs.
But just so incredible to see their life and their love story and what it gave birth to and what it allowed him to do.
Yeah.
I don't think you could, I feel like you could make the argument that he wouldn't have been able to do as much as he did had he not been with someone who understood that.
Right.
and what it meant, you know, for him to be called away and then to hold down the fort, if you will.
I think, you know, Ann knows far more about Ruth than I know. In fact, everything I ever learned about Ruth I've learned from Ann. But she was also perceptive. She was more conservative than he was, theologically and politically. Yeah. She had her own mind. But she was also very perceptive. And one of the lines that she articulated that I think was just brilliant is deep into his career. She said, he was not eloquent. If he had been eloquent, he would not have accomplished as much as he did. This is a remarkable statement.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's incredible, but as you said, she had so many of those gems that she said over the years. We could talk about the two of them and their relationship forever, but I do want to continue to delve into as much of his life and his legacy as we can. Thank you guys so much, both. You're sticking around, though. You're not going anywhere.
You can't get rid of us. Not that easily.
Thank you, Dr. Wacker. Stay with us. More after the break. Welcome back to this community conversation on the Reverend Billy Graham. We now want to talk about his one message and his influence throughout the globe. Of course, he preached the gospel so that all people who came to hear him or watch him over the years could be saved. I want to bring in Dr. Ricky Woods of First Baptist Church West here in Charlotte for this part of our conversation. And once again, our David Wisnett, who is, in his own words, a strong believer in Christ. So we appreciate the two of you being here tonight. And do you think that with so much of Dr. Graham's life and message being sort of back in the spotlight, back in the forefront, that this may allow a lot of people to have their faith renewed, or even for some of those that are hearing the gospel for the first time?
Possibly. I think what it allows, and I said this to David last week, that is allowing us to enter into a public conversation about religion without people being offended by it. In this pluralistic society, it's difficult for one group to sort of chant in the public square about their faith being the authentic faith. But it's allowing us to have this conversation, and people are willing to listen to it, hear about it, and engage in conversation and dialogue about it. And to that end, it's extremely helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think a lot of that comes back to Reverend Graham's credibility and his integrity. And so a lot of folks will look to him as the messenger and say, you know, yeah, he's always been a good guy. Even people who are outside of the Christian faith, I think, respected him. I think we've seen that from all of the sentiment that's been shown over the last week. So yeah, I think so. And I mean, I've been a news reporter for 26 years. I don't remember any time that Christianity has been the topic of conversation the way it has been. Local media, national media, and even today at the funeral, there were international news crews there. And so it's being presented not, you know, in a critical light or anything like that. It is simply, if you're going to talk about Billy Graham, you have to talk about his message. If you were to report on Cam Newton, you might have to mention football in there somewhere. So if you talk about Billy Graham, you've got to come up with that message, and I think that's sort of the genius of his ministry. And so even some of the folks with the Billy Graham Association today were talking about, you know, they were using this idea of calling this like the last crusade or his last crusade. Just to say that they too have noticed this great preponderance of people talking about Christianity coming from the place of Reverend Graham passing away.
And the thing about the conversation and talking about it, hopefully, Graham always felt and hoped and prayed that it would lead to a decision.
Yeah.
And he preached to some 215 million people who attended one of his more than 400 crusades, simulcast and evangelistic rallies in more than 185 countries and territories. So he really did reach millions. But in all that time, in all those years, his message stayed the same, stayed consistent, and was simple in some ways, you know, in terms of preaching the gospel.
We were talking about that last week, and you say, you know, he reached millions. He did, but I think he really did it one person at a time, because, again, it always came down to an individual decision. He spoke to you. He didn't say, y'all come on down. You know, he spoke to individuals and made it be something they had to come to terms with on their own. Would you?
I would agree with that. And I think the other thing about his message was he kept the focus on the cross. Graham didn't seek to try to answer the cultural question of the day with his sermon. And so much of the preaching today, quote, in order to make it relevant and reach the wrong people, is to start with their issues rather than starting with Jesus and the cross. Graham kept the focus on Jesus and the cross.
Can I get an amen?
Amen. Amen. And this is perfect lead into where I want to segue here, because some people may say that Reverend Graham's old school and his message may not be as relevant today to people. What do you all say to that?
Oh, the preaching of the gospel of the cross is relevant in every age for Christian faith. It is foundational. To be a scripture-believing Christian means that you have to take the cross serious. We're in this wonderful season of Lent, making our way toward Good Friday and the Easter resurrection, the highest time on the Christian calendar. And so what better time for us to be talking about the cross than now?
Yeah, obviously I would agree with that. I think it's a fresh contemporary message, and you know, you look at Paul's writings, for example, in the Gospels, and you see things that he talks about are still contemporary today. There were broad issues that were addressed. There were things that would happen to him along the way where he dealt with civil authorities and, you know, business people who didn't like what he was doing because he was taking away their customers, when he came along and said, these handmade idols aren't worth anything. So the silversmith said, oh, no, we got to stop this guy. So, yeah, it's still fresh. It's still contemporary. It still fits. So.
And clearly it does, because people, in your reporting, you know, people have come up to you and talk about what he meant to you, and again, this renewed sense of maybe ruminating on making this individual decision that he preached about so faithfully for so many years. Thank you, Dr. Woods. Thank you, David. Stay with us. More coming up right after this. Welcome back to our community conversation on the life and legacy of the Reverend Billy Graham. We have Ken Garfield from Myers Park United Methodist Church in Charlotte joining us here for the first time at the table tonight. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome. Once again, Dr. Ricky Woods and Dr. Grant Wacker back with us, because this time we want to talk about some of the tough moments in the spotlight over the life and career of Reverend Graham, starting with the civil rights movement. Because he did speak out against racism and segregation during his later revivals, even threatening to pack up shop and leave if they didn't take down the ropes that separated blacks from whites. So let's weigh in first have you guys weigh in first on that.
Well, I think Reverend Graham, like many good thinking people in those days, thought that there was a way to address this gradually. And so we was fine with bringing down the ropes. But when it came to supporting Freedom Summer, when it came to supporting some of the aggressive programming that impacted African Americans and other marginalized groups, he was not as supportive for, and thought that they should be obeying the laws of the land. Later in life, he said that he could have been more outspoken and more supportive of the civil rights movement, and understood it, looking back at it, quite differently than he did at that moment.
He deserved all the adulation that he got this week, but it's important to remember that he lived a long, historic life, and there is more gray than there is black and white, and his life was complicated, his public life was complicated, and there are degrees of what he did on all issues, and civil rights was probably the foremost about that.
I think that actually in the long run, where he'll have the most criticism was his waffling on the Vietnam War. Right. He has received criticism for some noxious comments he made about Jews. And I think if you put that in context, that they were probably unique, they will not loom as the greatest problem. The greater problem is a certain amount of ambiguity with his advocacy of racial justice, in the mid-career. In the early career, those are handsome years. Later on, they were handsome years. In the 60s, there was some ambiguity. But I believe that in the overall picture, his greatest problem was Vietnam. And when I look and I talk to my friends of my age, I'm in my 70s, and I talk to friends who were young men, vulnerable to the draft, sometimes sent to Vietnam. They looked to Graham as not a defender. Graham is a person who sold out to the establishment, to the man. Now, again, as Ricky is saying, this is one of the many places where he expressed regret. And later on, he said, I should have come out and opposed the war. One of the remarkable things about him is how quick he was to apologize for his mistakes. He learned from his mistakes.
Right.
But this was a mistake, and he learned from it.
It's interesting. This week we called him pastor to the presidents and America's pastor. And I always, covering him for The Observer, I always found that part of the story less compelling than pastor to ordinary people, than the people up in the last row of the stadiums. That to me was his power. And, you know, sure, he spoke, you know, truth to power when he was with presidents, but I think they also used him. I also think he pandered to a degree. I always thought that he was kind of starstruck. He was a farm boy from Charlotte, and he loved being around celebrity. He loved dropping names, and he kind of allowed himself, in my mind, to be sucked in somewhat, and I think the greatest example of that is Nixon and the tapes which expressed some anti-Semitism.
And the other thing, too, to remember is that Reverend Graham was an anti-communist, clearly. And taking the party line, going back prior to Vietnam and up through Vietnam, that we got to stop communist aggression anywhere. And supporting those policies of both the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration, interestingly, supporting Johnson on the war, but not supporting him on the war on poverty.
So to your point, we were seeing photos of him with celebrities, but you were saying what was more compelling is him being a pastor to ordinary people. And we do have some sound where he was in his element, preaching the gospel with a really powerful message. And we'll talk about it on the other side.
Christianity is not a white man's religion, and don't let anybody ever tell you that it's white or black. Christ belongs to all people.
So that's something that, a clip that I've seen several times over the past several days since his passing. And again, the ordinary people. You know, there might have been some well-known faces in that particular night of the crusade, but he was wanting to reach as many people as he can wherever they were in their lives at that time.
The best part of this week for me was everybody had a Billy Graham story. I would walk into church with a woman and she said, oh, my mother dragged me to the 57 Crusade in New York and it changed my life. Everybody had a moment with Billy Graham. And that was so touching to me. And this week is a great time for millennials, people perhaps that don't know the story, to learn the story and how he touched people one at a time. Today I was struck at the funeral when they talked about second chances and they talked about the hope that he gave people. That's the Billy Graham that touched me as a person and as a writer. That was the most powerful part to write about. Less so the Johnny Cashes and the Bob Hopes and that kind of thing. That was part of the larger story, but to me the really larger story was that individual out there with the Billy Graham story.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Ann and I have spent a good amount of time in the Billy Graham archives reading letters to Graham. And over the years, he received millions, I mean literally millions. Almost all of them have been destroyed for reasons of space, but there's several thousand have survived. And what has struck me powerfully is how freely people talked about their personal problems. Kids gone off the rails, marriages on the rocks, addictions, admitting marital infidelity. I mean, they talk about these problems and they tell him. He's receiving millions of letters and they still tell him as if he were their pastor or their next door neighbor. There may be some reasons why it was easier to tell him, in fact, than to tell the pastor or next door neighbor. But nonetheless, I mean, they reveal these things to him. And even more, we've read quite a few of the children's letters. And what I find very significant is most people called him Dr. Graham, Reverend Graham, Mr. Graham. Children usually called him Billy. And what strikes me there is that he offered children a safe space. They somehow sensed they were protected in writing him. The adults did too, but they showed it in different ways. And how did he connect? Because the vast majority of people couldn't ever meet him in person, and yet he related to them as if he did.
Just to bridge on that, I did a little picture book of Billy Graham, kind of celebrating his life, very unscholarly, and I gave it to David Bruce after it was published, who was his right-hand man, and I said, you know, this is written for everyday people. It's to sell in Walmart and Target. And David said, well, that's the people that Billy preached for. And I never forgot that. I also remember that there was a letter addressed to him in Minneapolis. It said Billy, and it was addressed to many apples. And it still got to him.
Well, I saw one envelope that had nothing but a picture of Billy on the envelope, and it still got there.
And that was the address.
That's it.
Wow.
The Postal Service, they knew.
Right. That just goes to show his reach. Did we have another? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Sorry. It's live television. Just work with us here, folks. Are there any final thoughts about this particular aspect of Reverend Graham's life that you guys wanted to speak to before we go to break?
I want to stress that I think it's very important not to put him on a pedestal, not to turn him into something that he didn't even remotely imagine that he was. He had problems like everybody, but unlike many people, he apologized and he learned and he tried to change his ways. He didn't always manage to change, especially when we talk about politics. He didn't do that entirely, but he tried to go a different way, and I find that just remarkable.
His frailty was part of his power.
Beautifully put, yes.
Frailty, part of his power.
Well, the scripture says that we have these treasures in earthen vessels.
Yes.
Wow.
And he was
earthen vessel.
A man first.
Yes.
Thank you, guys. We have more coming up right after the break. Welcome back to this special hour-long community conversation remembering Reverend Billy Graham. A quick note, want to welcome our viewers on Facebook that have been watching over the past 45 minutes as well. We see you, we thank you, we appreciate you.
And they hear us in commercial breaks.
They do, so hopefully you've been enjoying that as well. That's typically a side you don't get to hear or see. Welcoming Dr. Ann Wills and Steve Crump, our own Steve Crump, back to the table here alongside Dr. Grant Wacker, because we want to talk about Graham's global ministries. Born out of his message, preaching the gospel, and how he wanted to help as many as he could. You know, Samaritan's Purse, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, of course, the Billy Graham Library. Who would like to open
Let me
it up?
jump in on Samaritan's Purse, because 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Sudan and spend some time at Franklin Graham's compound in the Nuba Mountains in the southern part of Sudan. This is after the war there continued between the Muslims and the Christians. And Samaritan's Purse had a very strong operation there, because they had a seminary there where they were teaching people who were Arabic how to more or less let go some of the tenets of Islam and switch to Christianity. That was one part of it. But also beyond the ecclesiastical side of it, they were doing things like digging wells in communities and teaching people how to be self-sufficient. So having seen that firsthand, I mean, it was one of those things where you just kind of marvel at it. And in fact, Dr. David Chadwick from Forest Hills here in Charlotte, we were there 10 years ago this month, to be quite honest, and he had done a project from Charlotte called Sacks of Hope, where he raised roughly $500,000 to provide just basic supplies for some of the people there that live near Darfur. So, you know, that was one of those things of where the rubber definitely met the road.
And it feels like that was important, you know, to Reverend Graham, that is accompanying preaching the gospel and traveling the world doing that and bringing folks to Christ. He wanted to do more.
Go ahead.
Well, I think one thing that I would say, I mean, Dr. Wacker knows much more about the international side of Graham's work than I do, but when I think about the scope of his impact, and thinking about how to explain that, my mind goes to his working to create not a Billy Graham movement. It wasn't about him, and I think we saw that reflected in the funeral service today. He was trying to build up local churches, and I think that probably also extended around the world, that he was trying to he planted and trained pastors around the world. We definitely saw that in the service today. Some of the invocations and some of the words that were given during the service. But he wasn't interested in everybody reporting to Billy Graham. He was interested in people coming forward and then being connected in local communities to local churches, local worship communities, and then those communities enriching the environment that they were in.
People sometimes ask me what are the areas that most need to be studied in Graham's story, and I usually say there are two. One is we need to know a lot more about his life, and that book is coming. But beyond that, we need a lot more on the international Graham. And I'm convinced, and I think I'll explain why, that if he were here today and you could ask him, where do you think you made the biggest difference? I think he would say, in my international ministry.
Well, when you look at the fact that he was one of the first guys to go global, long before we've heard, things such as viral and all that, he was on the African continent preaching in the 1960s.
He was.
And even in as much as what we saw today, where there was somebody from Korea, somebody from the Middle East, these folks that were on the program, and in many regards it shows that his ministry came full circle, because he went out to the far reaches of the world, but on this day they came back to honor him.
Came back to him, yeah.
And the biggest one-day audience was not even here in the United States or in North America. It was in Korea, was it not? Over 1 million people, so I think that also speaks to the international Graham, as you were referencing.
Ken mentioned David Bruce, who is his closest associate, and David told me that not so long ago he asked Mr. Graham, if you could isolate your single accomplishment that you're most proud of, what's the most important thing you did? David said that he immediately answered the conferences. Conferences? And he was especially referring to Lausanne and the Amsterdam conferences. And Lausanne in '74 represented a conscious turn to a social ministry. Now, not in place of gospel, but along with and supported by Charlotte native Leighton Ford and Mr. Graham's brother-in-law. Certainly, yeah. But then the Amsterdam conferences were for itinerant pastors and evangelists. They were not for leaders. He was very clear, we don't want leaders here. What we want is ordinary folk, and train them and equip them so that they can take the gospel.
Well, and the other side, when you look at some of the things, and we haven't talked about this on the ground, when there's like fallout from hurricanes, you got the Billy Graham folks that are going in, like Hurricane Katrina. When we had the Keith Lamont Scott shooting here in Charlotte, and there were disturbances in the streets uptown, there were folks from the association that were out on the street with Charlotte Mecklenburg police officers ministering to some of the people that had some valid concerns. So it kind of goes beyond that.
Any final thoughts on his global ministry and, his goal of really putting it out there, and like you were saying, having people to start those connections in their own communities wherever they were across the globe? Just final thoughts.
There was one moment during the service today where one of those evangelists, I can't remember who it was, but they told a story about Ruth, actually, who connected. She asked, do you have an appointment to see Billy? And he said no, and she shepherded this man into the prayer room, and he talked today about finding Billy Graham there on his face in prayer. And I mean, there are a lot of things to think about in that story, but one of the things is that's Ruth connecting, first asking the question, do you have an appointment, and kind of being that gatekeeper, but also then working to connect this evangelist with her husband and you know, making that relationship, which still exists to this day.
I think in 100 years, historians will look at his whole story and they'll say that more than any other person, he is responsible for the globalization of evangelical Christianity. Millions have contributed to that, but one person more than any other helped facilitate it and make it happen.
Perfect place for a commercial break. Stay with us. Welcome back. You've been watching this special community conversation on the life and legacy of Reverend Graham, and we just want to wrap up the hour by talking about what's next. What will be his legacy and how that is continued, and so we want to get everyone's take on that. I want to start with our guest who came in tonight. We'll start with Dr. Grant Wacker.
In the 1980s, Mr. Graham was asked by journalists, will you have a successor? And he said, most definitely, but he said, my successor will be the thousands of people who have never heard my name, but who are taking the message of the gospel by bicycle along mountain paths. And I think that is his successor. It's not any one individual at all.
Anne?
Well, I think today, even in the service, we saw each of his children speak from kind of where they are. And while I don't think any of his children are going to be exactly his successor, I think they each have their own territory kind of mapped out. And some of his grandchildren are following in this tradition. So I think that'll be worth watching. That's what I'm keeping my eye on.
Ken?
I'm interested in whether millennials and the next generation will understand the legacy and whether they continue it or not, whether they understand the legacy and who this person and this man was and what his ministry did in this world. Maybe this is a teachable moment for this week, the funeral, to celebrate his life, whether that continues and we educated the next generation.
Dr. Woods?
No, I don't think that there will be a successor. I think the idea of succession in American culture always thinks that there has to be someone to do it the next time. The question was also raised of Dr. King at his passing, of Muhammad Ali. So I think that we need to celebrate Dr. Graham for the unique personality and the contributions he made to America and to Christianity and around the world, and leave it at that.
Liz?
Well, his grandson Will, Ann mentioned that, he's a good preacher, and he speaks a lot to youth and sort of tries to carry that mantle on through the next generation. Probably not on the scale of Granddad, obviously, but you know, that's part of carrying that forward. And then when you talk about Samaritan's Purse and Operation Christmas Child and things like that, that is going to keep going for years, and that's part of his legacy.
You know, and I agree with David, but I also think too that because this is so fresh, he's only been gone a week and a half. The reality is, I think historians will always be judging it. I think his legacy is a work in progress from the standpoint of where it will always be critically examined under the magnifying glass as well as the microscope.
Yeah.
Well said. Thank you to all of our guests tonight. Dr. Wacker, Dr. Wills, Ken, Dr. Woods, thank you so much. Steve, David, for your immeasurable commitment to what you do every day. I know it's been a long day. You hung around for us. We are grateful.
You said there'd be food.
Oh, did I? Okay. Thank you, guys. And thank you for watching this community conversation on Reverend Billy Graham here on WBTV News on Bounce. Thank you for watching on Facebook. We'll have a final wrap up at 11 over on WBTV. Good night.